This presentation is being recorded for future use by the Milwaukee Education Partnership. And now, Dr. Hendricks Williams.
Thank you, Gerard Randall, and good morning to everyone. I have the distinct and pleasurable honor of introducing Dr. Herring. Dr. Herring holds a Doctor of Philosophy degree in Educational Policy from Georgia State University and a Master of Science and Bachelor of Arts degrees from the University of Texas at Austin. She is married to Theodore Herring, who is the owner of a university insurance agency and an international business insurance consultant. They have 3 wonderful children, Emmanuel, Joshua, and Elizabeth. Dr. Herring has served on national and international boards, including serving as chair of the HBCU Academic of Deans of Education Council and as a member of both Deans for Impact and the advisory board for the Jandris Center for Innovative Higher Education. She has served as a member of the board of directors of the International Online Learning Consortium and a fellow in Australia. Dr. Herring also conceptualized the launch of Hampton U Online, the university's virtual campus for the delivery of online degrees and programs, opened the Hampton University International Office, a hub for supporting international students and faculty, promoting study abroad and building global connections. Dr. Herring served as the Dean of the School of Education and Human Development at Hampton University. Under her leadership, struggling education programs were transformed, earning state approval and highest commendation by accrediting bodies. She doubled her school's enrollment through strategic recruitment efforts and secured external resources for student support. Dr. Herring is the president and chief executive officer of Branch Alliance for Educator Diversity, Branch Ed, a startup that she incubated for a year as Dean in Resident at Deans for Impact. Branch Ed is a national effort to maximize programming and drive innovation to prepare a highly effective, diverse educators for all learning. Dr. Herring's passion about culturally relevant educator preparation reform fuels her work. I just want to share one quote that I found, if I can find it. Yes. What advice would you give to a young person interested in the profession and education? Dr. Herring responded, strive to create awe-inspiring, life-changing, positive experiences for young people. That's the fun part. I present Dr. Herring.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's funny, as you shared a few tidbits with me prior to us getting started this morning, I thought, where on earth did you find that? But absolutely, those are my words in terms of what advice I would give young people. I'm excited to be with you this morning. As I mentioned prior to us getting started, Mr. Randall, I feel like you and I go way back.
Yes, we do.
Particularly in tackling this issue of diversifying the teacher pipeline. I've had the pleasure of being with MEP in your state, in Milwaukee, spending time through the years. And so I'm excited to be here once again to talk a little bit more and a little bit broader about teacher diversity, past, present, and future, but really through the lens of, if we're gonna move this needle, we have to begin with the end in mind. On that note, I believe if we really want to diversify the teacher workforce, we need to understand 3 things. The first is the past. What is the history that impacts our current needs and understanding of diversity? Colleagues, if I could
Excuse me one moment.
Yeah, go ahead.
If those who are online can mute themselves so that we can have Dr. Herring's presentation unfiltered, we'd be appreciative. Thank you.
And I'll tell you, it's a challenge for me not to entertain questions throughout, but I'm happy to entertain any questions. Again, if you place them in the chat, I'm happy to address all of them. So 3 things: past, present, future. Quickly, the past, we want to understand the history of what sort of brought us to this place and impacts our current needs around teacher diversity. Second, we want to really unpack and explore what are the current challenges, and most importantly, those promising practices that help us lean in around this question. And then for me, really punctuate the future. Why now more than ever is it important that we put some emphasis and significance around teacher diversity and the imperative. So I'm going to chat about these 3 big buckets, and then I welcome a conversation with you about both what's happening in your Ed Prep program or in your district, and how we might begin to solve this problem together. So first, the past. Not so long ago, actually in 1983, with the publication of A Nation at Risk, this was the first time that teacher diversity became sort of a national issue. And in that report, it talked about the twin goals of equity and high quality schooling have profound and practical meaning for our economy and society. And we cannot permit one to yield to the other, either in principle and in practice. So this whole conversation around equity and diversity, quality and diversity has been longstanding, again, all the way back to A Nation at Risk. It's important to understand the history here. So from the 1960s to the 1980s, college growing was kind of rare, right? It was mostly top students, mostly affluent Caucasian males who took standardized tests like the SAT and the ACT and applied to and went to college. By the 1980s, college was more available to more people, and it was more important for getting actually a job. So many more people were taking standardized tests, applying to college and going to college. And in fact, this included more people of color, more low-income students, and other historically marginalized groups. So by the 1980s, we're seeing the complexion of higher education begin to shift. And of course, the call then for diversifying the teacher workforce also became much more relevant because the pool of candidates to become teachers was widening. So as I mentioned, A Nation at Risk was the first sort of national call to action around teacher diversity. It noted the shortage of, it called race and language minority teachers, and gave rise to the field of multicultural education. So multicultural education has been with us since A Nation at Risk. The response to this call to action in our country, though, really only focused on recruitment efforts, and alternative pathways to teaching was really born as a result or a response to this report. From the 1980s all the way through today, we have had some success in diversifying the teacher pipeline across the board. But that success has been achieved amid increasing challenge. For instance, in the 35 years since A Nation at Risk, the percentage of teachers of color in the workforce has grown from 12% to 20%. That's something I think we should be proud of and we should celebrate. Incoming teachers, first-year teachers, have become even more diverse. In fact, 25% of first-year teachers in 2015 were non-white. This is up from 10%, so a full 15 percentage point jump in the diversity of new teachers as well. All of this success, though, has happened when the student population, the PK-12 student population within our public schools, has also dramatically shifted and become increasingly diverse. In fact, 51%, 52%, I think is the very latest information out last month, of American school children are children of color. And because of the rise in the percentage of students of color in our schools, and the unfortunate fact that teachers of color are leaving the profession at higher rates, something that we often call the leaky bucket, then we have success, but we have to temper that, again, with the increasing challenge of beginning to try to find closer parity between the teacher workforce and the student workforce. I should note here, as was in my introduction, I'm the president and CEO of the Branch Alliance for Educator Diversity. We support a network of teacher preparation programs across the country at 148 minority serving institutions across 36 states, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. And one thing that we're very proud of in that community is that teachers of color who are prepared by minority serving institutions persist in the profession longer. So as we talk about the retention rate of teachers of color, I always have to give that caveat. There is something in the secret sauce of MSIs, the special sauce of MSIs, and the way that they prepare teachers of color that give them that stick-to-itiveness. And again, research has demonstrated that they persist in the profession longer. In 2014, students of color became the majority within public schools. And so I say that only because there is in our national conversation some resistance to continuing to use the term minority when we're talking about public school students. They in fact are the majority. And so just to call out this use of language, we know words are power. If we are talking about students of color and talking about them as the minority, and we can no longer use that as a quantitative definition of how they show up in our schools, then unfortunately, the qualitative sense of that word is the interpretation. So we often talk about students of color being minoritized as opposed to minority. I hope the English language arts folks who are on the call appreciate that pause in terms of language. So that really brings us to the present. We have 52% of our students in America's classrooms are students of color. And then again, a smaller percentage, 20% of our teachers are teachers of color in American schools. This is important, and it's not just important because Branch Ed says so. There have been many, many, many research reports that have called this out. And the Shanker Institute back in 2015 said, while there is reason to believe that Black, Hispanic, and American Indian students would be the greatest beneficiaries of a diverse teaching workforce, there is evidence that all students and our democracy at large would benefit from a teaching force that reflects the full diversity of the US population. But the reality is we have a diversity gap, and that's the difference in proportion of teachers of color and students of color in our schools. Another call out, a shout out to minority serving institutions in our country. Of that 20% of teachers, 48% of them have been prepared at minority serving institutions. Again, an important point for us to know as we think about diversifying the teacher workforce. Again, one that's not lost on MEP, as they have invested in building bridges with MSIs into the Milwaukee public schools and others. Why is all of this important? You know, it was funny when I just began this work at Branch Ed, and I was talking with funders and other influencers, and finally someone said, you know, why does all of this diversity stuff matter? And I really appreciated that conversation because it's important for us to remember that diversity isn't just a nice to have. As some would say, it's a moral imperative. It's actually more than just a moral imperative as well. It's an academic necessity. What we know is that having diverse educators in our nation's classrooms benefits all students and helps them prepare to succeed in our heterogeneous society. Not only does it help to sort of counteract inequity, systemic inequity, and undermine student learning, we know from research that students of color earn higher test scores, have higher high school completion rates, college going rates, attendance rates when they're taught by teachers from their own racial and ethnic groups. Now, please don't hear me. I am not an advocate for race matching. Again, we believe that a diverse teacher workforce impacts all learners. And part of that comes from findings in psychology and cognitive science that suggests that experiences with counter-stereotypical authority figures, like teachers, like principals, can decrease prejudice responses to diverse others. Therefore, all students benefit from a diverse teacher workforce. It builds within them something called cultural dexterity. And that's important, not just within the United States, but if we think about the world becoming much, much smaller and having a global, being able to interact globally, then being able to have that cultural dexterity is important for all of America's young people. Again, at Branch Ed, we are a one-of-a-kind organization. Our vision is highly effective, diverse educators for all learners. We're not about diversity for diversity's sake. Highly effective, diverse educators is important to us. And again, we were recognized by Ed Week as one of the 10 big ideas in education back in 2018. So how do we unpack this challenge of diversifying the teacher workforce? It may seem like something so large that it's hard for us to get our arms around. I argue or offer to you that it really is two challenges, not just one. The first challenge certainly is a pipeline issue. We've talked, many people talk about the pipeline into teaching. And what we know is that the path toward reaching a diverse teacher workforce is much steeper than anyone ever thought to date. Not just because of recruitment that districts have to contend with. How do they find and recruit teachers of color to work in their schools? But it goes all the way back to public education. How many students are actually graduating from high school, going to college, applying for teacher prep programs, completing those programs, and then entering the profession? So we know that it's much steeper and much more complex as a pipeline issue than we have accomplished in the past. But I would argue that it's more than just a pipeline issue. There's also actually a systemic issue that we should acknowledge in this moment. And the systemic issue is really around how are we preparing all educators, not just men and women of color, but all educators with the mindsets and the skill sets that they need to positively impact children regardless of their demographics. And this systemic issue has been tackled in several different forms over the years, from conceptions of culturally responsive teaching, culturally relevant pedagogy, even culturally sustaining practice. Regardless of the set of words that is used here, the intent is, how do we begin to make more explicit the value added by acknowledging individual student identity and diversity in the classroom? How do we begin to better equip teachers to understand that diversity and identity is absolutely a positive lever for learning in the classroom? And if it's one that we negate or that we assume implicitly will be dealt with, then we're missing the opportunity to really level the playing field and to help all students learn. So regardless of sort of, again, the label, the specific label that's placed here, the systemic issue is, how do we begin to make explicit the advantages and the lever that culture and identity and diversity play in the classroom? It's important to note that quality preparation for culturally and linguistically sustaining practice is necessary even when teachers are from the same cultural, racial, and socioeconomic background of students. So this is not saying, Caucasian teachers, we need you to think differently or prepare differently. This is saying that all of our teachers need to have a stronger toolkit, a stronger set of mindsets around how identity, diversity shows up in the classroom and how they can lean in around those characteristics in order to bring about learning. So this truly is a systemic issue. Again, if we use the pipeline metaphor, this is the whole plumbing system that heretofore we have been relatively silent about, at least in teacher prep, unless it was sort of an arm to multicultural education. So how can we begin, again, to embed it within what we're doing? So I'm going to leave the systemic issue and really drill down on the pipeline issue, because I think for all of the folks in this meeting and on this call, this is where we really have an opportunity to lean in. We like leaks in education, so this is the leaky pipeline terminology that some folks often use. And as we look across this graphic, there are several points where we're losing potential teachers along the way. So again, going all the way back to K-12 matriculation, how many of those K-12 students actually get turned on to the possibility that teaching might be a career? Then how many are recruited into, go to college and are recruited into teacher preparation programs? And then of course, how many persist through those programs? How many are inducted within the profession? And then how many ultimately are retained? All across this, this pipeline, as you can tell that the graphic helps to represent, we lose potential candidates, particularly candidates of color. And so at the very end of the pipeline, we see one little drop, when in fact we could have a larger flow. I'm going to spend some time, not with the K-12 matriculation, but certainly the other points of the pipeline, talking about what are we learning, right? From all of the work that Branchette is doing, from the literature, from promising practices that we've seen across the country. What are we learning as opportunities to implement practices and different protocols to help with this pipeline issue? Again, just to talk about the shrinking pool of potential candidates, we know a smaller portion of African American and Latinx students enter college and earn degrees. We know that interest in a teaching career among college students and graduates of color is lower than Caucasian students. African American and Latinx teachers are hired for teaching jobs at lower rates than Caucasian teachers. And then of course, African American and Latinx teachers are retained in jobs at lower rates than Caucasian teachers. So we really have sort of compounded challenges as it relates to diversifying our teacher workforce. But again, I'm about solutions, not just the problem. So let's talk about what is working as it relates to the different points on the pipeline. First of all, at that first sort of juncture of recruitment, we have seen targeted recruitment campaigns be very successful in terms of reaching out to students. Even if we think back to A Nation at Risk, one of the main responses to that report was to increase recruitment campaigns, targeted recruitment campaigns, and they can be successful. The one thing that I would say though is that recruitment can't just be about figuring out what carrot to dangle. Right? It actually has to be an authentic way of presenting the career of teaching as an option, a viable option for communities of color, and then programs being able to really present how they are the hospitable places where these candidates can be successful. Non-traditional selection processes. What we know a lot about teacher prep programs is there's sort of a checklist of requirements. Have you taken these courses? Do you have this GPA? And what we're seeing across the country is programs that are including an opportunity to try on teaching. So there's an opportunity for service learning, or there's an opportunity for an early field experience, not student teaching, but early in the program to get out in the field and be with young people. An interview process that includes some engagement with in-service teachers, alumni, or the like. Has also been very successful in terms of recruiting more students of color. It's that building of relationship with that prospective student, understanding their affective reasons for choosing teaching, and then being able to connect the dots with those affective reasons why the student might want to go into education. As I mentioned before, it's not just about dangling carrot, it's also about being really clear in terms of how the curriculum of teacher preparation is leaning in with candidates around their affective reasons for choosing teaching. So a curriculum, for instance, we've seen in California in some of the areas that have high migrant populations, a lot of their candidates coming from those communities. When there are places and spaces within the curriculum where candidates can think about their educational experience as migrant learners, potentially service learning around migrant populations, and a curriculum that talks about how as an educator can you lean in with that specific population of students. Those are attractive. What we heard as we interviewed candidates in that particular program, they said, those learners are me, like I am that learner. That's why I wanted to be in this program, because I wanted to make a difference for the kids that are coming behind me. Grow Your Own is still a very popular avenue as well to recruitment. This is where districts, and hopefully in partnership with EPPs, are building programs collaboratively that create a nice bridge into the profession for students from high school through college and into the profession. So these are all promising practices that are noted in the literature. Specific examples certainly of each are there. When we talk about preparation, and here I'm primarily talking about university-based teacher preparation programs, we know that what happens in the classroom is important, but student support is also important. And when I talk about student support, I'm talking about financial, academic, and social support. Many teacher prep programs have implemented cohort models so that candidates don't feel like they are progressing alone or by themselves through the program. There is a system of support of their peers. Academic could be tutoring, it could be test prep, it could be all of those other sort of academic supports outside of the classroom that are important. And then of course, financial. The second bullet here is really important. As I have gone around the country and talked with groups of faculty, teacher prep faculty, that are very interested in making more explicit culture and identity and the impacts on teacher prep, what they have said to me is, I know why and I want to do it. I don't know how. I don't feel like I am literate enough, equity literate enough, to be able to change my curriculum in the way that it needs to happen. And so equity literate faculty is really important. And so for those on the call that are in teacher prep programs, this is a look in the mirror, right? That we have to take. Are our faculty equipped to take on issues of identity, of race, of economic diversity or linguistic diversity? What kind of professional development can we have with our own faculty in order to get them ready to both create and implement that multicultural social justice curriculum, excuse me, that we know is a promising practice for attracting and retaining, candidates of color. We've talked about affective engagement already. And then the last bullet here, I think we're taking a note from alternative routes. That you have to have flexible program delivery models, whether that is hybrid, residency, other kinds of practice-based approaches are actually more attractive or becoming more attractive for candidates of color. I will say those first 4 bullets, again, are very representative of sort of the MSI special sauce or secret sauce. These are things that minority serving institutions do exceptionally well. At Branch Ed, we have incorporated those best practices into our framework for quality preparation. And I like to say the term, it takes a community to train a teacher. So not just the university, but also the community. There's a strong emphasis on family and community engagement within the sort of MSI formula for high quality educator preparation. Data, hugely important, but not data because the devil made you do it. So not data for compliance sake, but how can data actually empower your decision making, empower the way in which you're working with candidates. It's a little bit of a different view of how we think about data, how we think about a culture of inquiry and the like. Focusing on content knowledge for teaching, not just subject matter expertise, huge emphasis on learning by doing. So it's not just that we're reading about leading a classroom discussion, we're actually practicing that work in a variety of contexts. Thinking about faculty pedagogy, faculty andragogy, how are faculty modeling inclusive practice, ensuring that rigor is not diminished. So it's not that, oh, I'm gonna do CLSP and I'm not gonna worry about rigor. No, how are you doing both at the same time? right? How are those absolutely intertwined? And again, that support outside the classroom. Let's talk quickly about induction. And this is once candidates have sort of finished the teacher prep program, they're graduating from university, how are they moving into those first jobs? I was a dean of the College of Education at Hampton University for 10 years prior to founding Branch Ed. And one thing I would always say to my faculty is, our job doesn't stop at graduation. In fact, if our candidates don't make it through the novice period of in-service, then we have failed. So we continue to follow our graduates, at least for the first 2 years into teaching, so that we knew that they had a strong bridge into the profession. Things like having authentic experiences for pre-service that help them walk smoothly into in-service. Working with our districts to be more proactive about hiring. We had in the fall semester of our candidates last year what we called a sneak peek. It was both so that the districts could see and begin to get some relationship with our candidates, but also so our candidates could see the kinds of opportunities that they might consider. Again, this was far before the spring hiring season. So being proactive about making those connections, helping candidates explore what opportunities might be available to them is important. Can't underestimate induction support. Again, I've seen that happen across the country in lots of different ways, whether it is district driven, whether it is EPP driven. The primary thing is that there is a collaboration, there is a partnership there. As we, in my former deanship, we worked with our principals actually to say, we want to follow our graduates. We are not evaluating the school. We are simply here to support our new teacher. And we did that for 1 year, by the way, with no grant money. We did it because it was the right thing to do and we wanted to support our candidates. By year 2 of doing this program, we had principals asking us, can you support all of our first year teachers? Because our graduates hit the ground running so well. So this can be done, and I will say there's not a huge financial burden on it. It can be done, and it's important to do so. Of late, I'll say in the last 2 or 3 years, affinity groups have also become very popular for populations of teachers of color. Black male teachers, for instance, having an affinity group, a place where they can come together to talk about their experiences, find those informal mentors, have a sense of community. Not that it's separate from everyone else, but that it's a place where they can have their unique situation and needs met and support one another. Lastly, I'll talk quickly about in-service teacher retention and some of the best practices that we're seeing there, particularly around teachers of color. What we have seen over and over and over again in the literature around why teachers of color leave, it is primarily working conditions, and working conditions that are specifically attributed to school leadership. This is one reason why Branch Ed is now working with in-service school principals to talk about how are you creating hospitable environments, particularly for teachers who are coming in with a strong social justice perspective and a skill set around inclusive instruction that may be novel in that school environment. I have talked with lots of principals, and I remember one conversation where the principal said, well, she tells all of her first year teachers, forget everything you learned in prep, we're starting fresh. And she said that as if it was a badge of honor. And it just hit me through the heart, because I thought, whoa, if they just spent 3 years in a teacher prep program or 4 years at university, why on earth on day one are they told to forget all of that? So we have to do a better job of aligning around a shared understanding and value for equity enriched teacher preparation and how that translates into in-service performance. Teacher leadership and mentoring opportunities, we know this from every single profession that this adds value. When folks, particularly novice professionals, have the opportunity for guidance and mentorship. This of course plays out as well as we look at the literature on the retention of teachers of color. And then the last one is a question. It's a question that arises for me. It doesn't come necessarily out of the literature. But my question is retention a reasonable goal? You know, gone are the days when individuals went to work for a company and they were with that company for 20 years. Gone are the days, right, where folks sort of found one place and stayed forever. Our world is changing, our economy is changing. Should education be changing as well? Is there a new sort of tour of duty kind of structure that we ought to be thinking about in education, and being intentional about how then are we thinking about the teacher career journey, the teacher career arc, and ways that folks can both move into, move out of the profession, move up and move around. It's just a question. I hope it's not an unpopular one, but something that I think we have to think about, again, as we're looking at the world and the economy changing. On that note, and I'll finish here because I see the chat, several questions are happening and I'd love to get to those. The future. US population projections suggest that by 2055, the US will not have a single racial or ethnic majority. In fact, our diversity will become our norm. Over the next 5 decades, the majority of US population growth is projected to be linked to new Asian and Hispanic immigration. And today, near record 14% of the country's population is foreign born, when you compare that to 1965, which was just 5%. So as we look at the Pew Research Center's projections around population, the changing face of America, again, you can see that the very significant diversification of our population. And of course, when we look at our schools, it's even more so. So diversity is not going away. The research says that many teachers, Caucasian teachers, feel like diversity is a necessary evil. It is about to be the norm. And so it is imperative that we now begin to think about, how do we prepare for this norm? How do we prepare for this new norm and the teachers that will support it? Again, you can see the largest immigrant group, at least, will be Asian, with Hispanic shortly there behind. It's also important to note that not only is it population statistics that sort of punctuate the imperative around teacher diversity, but there are a couple of other key issues around diversifying the pipeline. If we look at the Gen Zers, those students that are currently in school, we know that they are the most connected, most diverse generation in our nation's history. And so given that, a few key issues are really important. Relationships matter. We can't get away from that. You remember the 3 R's: rigor, relevance, and relationships. Relationships are important. And so we have to begin to think about, how are we cultivating a pool of educators that can really build those positive relationships with young people. Secondly, we have to begin to stress students' strengths, not emphasize their deficits. So putting on an asset-based approach to all of the different kinds of funds of knowledge that children bring into classrooms is hugely important. And therefore, we have to begin to be more explicit in how we're preparing teachers to do those things. And then lastly, communities of color need to see schools as relevant and committed to educating their children. The whole issue of belonging is hugely important for families and communities, as important as it is for young learners. How can we ensure that school environments are environments that are inclusive, that are welcoming, and that are places where all children can be inspired to excel and to reach their full potential? All of these issues and this population statistics suggest that now is the time to get serious and begin working to solve the teacher diversity issue. I sort of leave you with one more quote from where we started, A Nation at Risk. It says, "The Commission deeply believes that the problems we have discerned in American education can be both understood and corrected if the people of our country, together with those who have the public responsibility in the matter, care enough and are courageous enough to do what is required." Thank you so much. I'm excited to entertain questions, and I'm going to stop sharing so I can see faces.
Dr. Herring, thank you so much. Dr. Barbara Bales is the Director of Strategic Initiatives and Educational Innovation in PK through 20 and education programs. The MEP is tremendously grateful to Dr. Bales for her extraordinary efforts to present Dr. Herring today. I'm personally grateful as well, knowing that Dr. Bales gave some of her vacation time to this endeavor. Dr. Bales will guide our discussion this morning, and I give you now Barbara.
Thank you, Mr. Randall. That's great introduction. And, you know, we work tirelessly with great people, and that's what makes our work really special. Dr. Herring, thank you so much for really informative and uplifting, I have to say, chat and discussion. There are a couple questions. I'm going to read from the notes. The first is, what can we learn from minority serving institutions about building relationships with potential candidates and their families? You touched on that. Maybe you might be able to expand on that a little bit, please.
Absolutely. And I thank you for the question, that it's not just the candidates, it's also the families. What we have learned, particularly around MSIs that, let me go back. MSIs typically are geographically situated within the communities that they serve. Hispanic serving institutions typically are in communities that are primarily Hispanic. And what we know about that is that students who attend those universities tend to want to go back to their local communities. And so as a part of sort of the ethos of minority serving institutions, they are very connected to the community. And many of them do a significant amount of outreach to families. So recruiting a college student to an MSI is not just about recruiting that student, but it's also about engaging that full family. What we have seen is we've seen family days that are recruitment days. As a dean at an HBCU myself, we would have opportunities for parents to come and ask questions about education. Unfortunately, parents were often the dissuaders. They wanted their children to seek careers that would be more lucrative. And so they oftentimes would not necessarily hold up education as the appropriate career choice. So we took the opportunity to educate on the absolute value and advantage that a career in teaching would have. And we had to do that with families and young people. So I think the internalization of the opportunity, I won't say the requirement, but certainly the opportunity to think about a young person and his or her immediate family as all being important to inform and engage around the choice of a teaching career is one that's significantly important. And the other thing, as I mentioned, is that connection to community. I think for school districts that are seeking to recruit more teachers of color, oftentimes we don't talk about that community connection. We talk about other things through the HR process, but those are things that matter. If you think about a student who went to school to be that teacher that they perhaps did not have, or to be, or if they come wanting to be a teacher because they have a strong commitment to that community, then those are important things that candidates are looking for, right? Those graduates are looking for as they're interviewing. I always want to remind folks that interviewing is a two-way street. And so if you're interviewing a lot of candidates for your teaching positions, candidates of color for your teaching positions, and not actually getting them to accept that offer, it could be that somewhere in your process, you're not highlighting those, again, connections that are important or that matter to those teachers.
Thank you. Another question that somebody had, and I'm kind of paraphrasing it here,
Sure.
is that in these challenging COVID times,
Yes.
schools going into virtual, not virtual, face-to-face, young people in particular being oftentimes less cautious as they move through their young adult life.
Mhm.
Sometimes the districts are less inviting to invite our candidates into the schools.
Mhm.
At the same time, these are going to be the teachers who will be teaching in hopefully we don't have another one of these, but in challenging situations, whether they go work in places that get, you know, are subject to hurricanes or earthquakes or fires. So what kind of information could you share about how this partnership might, and again, I'm paraphrasing the question, we often look for the ideal situation for our teacher candidates, but we want them to get into the messiness of it, of what can you make some recommendations or share some of your experiences?
Sure. As I mentioned earlier, we work with 148 colleges of education at MSIs across the country. And of course, during the pandemic, we really led by listening to our leaders within those programs. We've done a great deal of outreach to faculty. And one of the main things that has come up in those conversations is how faculty are working with candidates, not just around their own sort of situation, their own personal and professional situation, but really talking with them about the moment of responsibility as a teacher in this moment. We've spent a lot of time, we spend a lot of time in teacher prep talking about sort of the academic requirements, the instructional stance. The faculty within these institutions have spent a lot of time of late talking about the heart work. So not just the hard work of teaching, but the heart work of teaching, and how caring for themselves in this moment, ensuring that they are following all of the CDC guidelines and are particularly protective of their own health, has to be exponentially important in a time when they would be standing up in front of young people. So while college students may be characterized as more risky, or at least not taking on the same sense of the weight of this moment, I would argue that is not happening in teacher prep programs, because faculty are emphasizing that their health is not just for their sake, but it is now for the sake of the young people that they serve. And we're seeing that with in-service teachers that have on their superhero capes, where that is being explicit in conversations with candidates, particularly those that are nearing the end of their program that might be going into student teaching. This is not something that institutions are silent about. In fact, this is something that they are impressing upon their candidates, the importance of that responsibility, the importance of not just the empathy, but the sense of responsibility that they carry with them into schools. And so I would say for districts that may have some hesitance, as we've counseled with several that have called us and said, we're not sure, but we need to hire. So how do we connect with candidates even in this time when we're not sure? What I have said to those districts, what I have said to EPPs that have said, we need to place our students, but the districts are closing the door. One takeaway from this moment is the significant importance and power of partnership. What we have found is districts and EPPs that had strong partnerships prior to the pandemic, they are being able to innovate in unique and creative ways. There's a shared understanding. There's a level of trust that is absolutely carrying the day. For those districts and EPPs that perhaps didn't have strong partnerships, that don't have a high level of trust, they are the places where there has been more challenge. And so my advice is to open up really rich conversation about how is the EPP counseling their candidates around their responsibility in this moment. What are some of the safeguards that the university has in place around those candidates? And I would say open up that conversation first before thinking, oh, it's not possible, it's not safe. Like, we understand the weight of on decision making at the district level right now, no question. I also understand, though, that candidates could be an incredible force, an incredible additional set of hands in this moment. And let me go back to give you an example. So at the beginning of the pandemic, back last spring, March, April, and this is a testament to the power of partnership, there was obviously we all sort of went to shelter in place. There was a district whose teachers didn't necessarily have strong technology skills. So the effort to move courses online Like it was gargantuan. But because they had a strong partnership with the Ed Prep program, the Ed Prep program said, but wait a minute, we've been emphasizing technology with our candidates, and not just those students, those candidates in student teaching, but they deployed all of their candidates in one-to-one partnerships with in-service teachers, where the teachers had the subject matter expertise, the candidates had the technology expertise, and together they built out courses in the spring. That's a powerful example of the kind of innovation that can happen amid challenge when you have a strong partnership and you can have authentic conversation about what do we need and from one another, and how can we help one another in this time. And what an incredible opportunity for candidates to be both sort of the teacher and the learner. And the teachers actually raved about having that extra set of hands that could just, you know, that could help them with where do you point and click, how do you load a video, how do you get into Blend and the other things. So it's critical. Partnerships are critical. I think if we have learned anything in this time that absolutely has to carry forward beyond the pandemic, it's that those partnerships are critical to surmount any challenge. And you know, again, I'm happy to be a thought partner, but we've seen innovation happen around making sure that our K-12 learners are safe and that our teacher candidates have opportunity to try on the practice of teaching, because that's critically important as well. Long answer, Barbara, but I hope that gets at the question.
It touched on a lot of different concerns that I have heard over this period of time, as well as the question in the chat.
Sure.
So is, would you please talk a little bit more about the support you're able to provide to your Hampton graduates in their first years as teachers in the school?
Yes, I would love to do that. Again, what we at Hampton were hearing from our graduates, and we had kind of a luncheon where we would invite back all of our graduates as we penned our newly minted teachers right before graduation. And it was really more of a social time and an exciting time to kind of pass the torch to the new group of teachers. And so faculty were excited to re-engage their graduates and the like. But one thing that the faculty started hearing were our graduates saying, oh gosh, you know, I really wish I could have talked to you. I had this one student, I didn't know how to deal with this, or, oh, I really miss when we used to be able to look at videos and talk through what I could do better. And so I had a faculty member who came and said, what if we continued sort of the connection, kind of like student teaching, but continue that within their first year? Because if they're asking for support, is it okay if I just go support them? Or do we have to have systems and structures in place? And of course, I'm like, no, we can absolutely not just pop in a school without having some conversation with the school. So we had a small group of first year teachers. I think there was one second year teacher. Again, our graduates that had been hired by 3 schools. And so we reached out to the principal and said, you know, we want to try something. We're going to call it the Novice Teacher Support Program. These are our novice teachers. We would like to continue to support them through their first year of teaching. What might that look like? In the first year, it looked exactly like student teaching, right? Where there were monthly calls, which brought all of the first year teachers together with conversations around what was showing up for them in the classroom, where areas that they could be supportive and the like. There were observations, so our clinical faculty went out and observed them, gave them feedback, same thing, took videos of the practice, debriefed those videos, and then there was sort of the on-demand. They had someone to call. What we said to the principals is that, again, we're not there to evaluate the school, we're not even evaluating the students. We are literally there as a line of support to our teacher. And we had to be explicit that we're not there to replace the district assigned mentor either, but what we understand is we have a relationship with this teacher. And so where that first year teacher might feel a bit apprehensive about the kinds of questions that it's okay to ask, or the repercussions of asking questions, they didn't have that with their faculty, right? They had already grown up in their development with the faculty. And so what ended up being the 3 years of support, the first year, again, very much like student teaching, with monthly check-ins, with the classroom observations, and with the opportunity to request support. The second year, that was all sort of dialed back. There was one observation per semester. There was the opportunity to ask for support. We said that the monthly check-ins were optional, but I'll tell you, all of them still called in. They appreciated that support system. And then by year 3, it was only really on demand. If they called us, we were there. The second year, I might add, we were only doing observations and focusing on areas that we thought needed further development. So the first year, it was the full gamut of what we would have done during student teaching, just in an in-service environment. The second year, it was really leaning in on those areas in need of development. And the third was at request. We ended up partnering with the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards. We got a small grant to continue the work, as principals were saying, can you do this with all of our first year teachers, not just your grads? And so we continued the work through my deanship. I don't know if the program is still in place today, but it was powerful. It was powerful in terms of the principal's comments about the impact. It was powerful in terms of the candidates feeling even more comfortable in their own practice. We had 2 of our teachers that were awarded Teacher of the Year. And we think having that support system, having that extra sort of place to go for help was important in that. So I'm happy to talk about that more, but that's kind of the overview of the program.
Wonderful. That, I think that got to a lot of the things. So, and I'm in teacher education policy. That's my research area.
Yeah.
And so, as you've talked about the structures in place, and that it's not necessarily just it's person to person, but it's also has to have the support systems in place.
Absolutely.
What do you think about in terms of should these kinds of relationships be codified in policy, or do you see them being that third R about relationships, and that it's that kind of balance?
Yeah, I'll answer that a couple of different ways. I think we have seen kind of both extremes, right? We have seen EPP and district partnerships that were really so based on individual personality and individual relationships that we've had to ask the question, is this sustainable, right? What if that director of clinical experience leaves? Does that mean that the whole relationship falls apart? So to the extent that we think that there should be systems and structures in place that persist beyond personality, that there's a strong MOU between the 2 entities, that part of that MOU talks about not just what the EPP gets, which often is the one way, right? But also what's in it for the district. How is this relationship mutually beneficial? And then what are the protocols and procedures for things to get done? That should be codified into some sort of a document. Again, so that it can persist beyond individual personalities. But we're strong proponents that those relationships need to be context driven, right? And so if you're talking about policy with a big P, I don't necessarily think the federal government needs to legislate how EPPs and districts work together. Like, I think that that's an overreach, and they don't understand the nuances of teacher prep anyway. So I don't think that it should have that large of a policy sort of structure for how the collaboration gets done. I think that is important, that individual localities are able to negotiate that. But I do believe districts ought to be incentivized to enter into strong partnerships with teacher prep. Obviously, for the purposes of accreditation, program approval, like there are lots of reasons why EPPs need to have good partnerships with districts. We have a saying, by the way, at Branch Ed, that those partnerships shouldn't just be a handshake, right? They should be a huddle. And so if you're talking about moving from a transactional, yeah, we'll place your student teachers, okay, if you're talking about moving away from that handshake model of partnership to one that's more of a huddle, where we have a shared understanding of what excellent teaching looks like. We're working together around recruitment, induction, all of those different handoffs. We're literally strategizing together, executing together, evaluating on that execution together. That's a big ask of the district partner. And correct me if I'm wrong, I don't see, as I look across the country, a whole lot of incentive in districts, immediate incentive in districts doing that work. Yes, you hope that the program is producing teachers you want to hire, but that could be several years down the road. And so I do think policy makers ought to think about what are some of the systems and structures that might incentivize districts to engage with prep programs in the way, again, that we characterize as the huddle and not just the handshake.
That's a great analogy. Great analogy. That is the end of our questions. I'm going to pass this back over to Mr. Randall. Wonderful, absolutely wonderful talk.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Well, first off, thank you again, Dr. Bales. Thank you, Dr. Hendricks-Williams, for making the introduction and welcome today. And Dr. Herring, thank you. First off, for our long-standing collaboration.
Yes.
And for your informative and frankly, very, very engaging conversation with us this morning. You left us with some challenges, and we are prepared to pick up the mantle and move forward, hopefully in collaboration with you, as always, as we address some of these issues and try to address the pipeline issues, certainly, that we have in our communities here in Wisconsin. The Milwaukee Education Partnership has the largest partnership with historically Black colleges and universities of any PK through 12 school district in the country. And in fact, we've expanded that not just from Milwaukee, but to Racine as well. And so this conversation was very important for us as we begin to look at ways in which we can address some of these issues that tend to vex us around moving more people of color into the teacher ranks. And your conversation certainly has helped us to focus our attention on how we can best do that. The MEP will contact those of you who participated in today's conversation, and we hope to engage you with our work as we create work groups to address some of these issues. So you'll be hearing from us over the next several weeks. We understand that we have the holidays that are coming between some of the things that we want to do and those things that we have to do. But we will be making contact with you based on your RSVP to us and those who weren't able to join us today. Thank you, Dr. Herring, for allowing us to represent this presentation to those who are a part of our education community around the state. So again, thanks to all of you who joined us today. Thanks to those of you who helped us make this presentation possible. And again, thank you, Dr. Herring, for being with us this morning and sharing with us your thoughts. Have a great week.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, thank you. And you know, Mr. Randall, if I can be helpful, if Branch Ed can be helpful, don't hesitate to reach out.
You know, we're counting on that. Thank you.